Welcome to meeting number 4 of the Subcommittee on International Human Rights. As members are well aware, we'll be hearing from several human rights organizations tonight and humanitarian organizations as well. With us today, Ms. Ketty Nivia Bandi, the Secretary General of Amnesty International. We have Madame France-Isabelle Langlois, the Executive Director of Amnesty Internationale Canada Francophone. And we also have Mr. Hillel Neuer, the Executive Director of UN Watch. Andy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and good evening, dear members of the committee. I'd like to start by thanking the committee for inviting Amnesty International to speak to the state of human rights globally. We're certainly meeting at a glim time. So there are several grave and urgent situations that merit your attention: China, Sudan, Afghanistan, Yemen, West Cameroon, among others. And I would be happy to brief you further on these in the future. But today, as requested, I will focus my intervention on a few crises that are not widely covered in the Canadian media. I'll start with Israel and the occupied Palestinian territories. After 4 years of extensive research and analysis, Amnesty International released a report earlier this month, which documents how Israel enforces a system of oppression and domination against the Palestinian people wherever it has control over their rights. This includes inside Israel, in the occupied Palestinian territories, as well as displaced refugees in other countries. Our 274 pages research and analysis details how Israel's appalling treatment of Palestinians meets the definition of apartheid, a crime against humanity under international law as defined in the Rome Statute and the Apartheid Convention. Decades of deliberate and equal treatment have left Palestinians marginalized, impoverished, and in a state of constant fear and insecurity. And as we speak, Palestinians are being forced out of their home, separated from families, and confined to checkpoints and walls. This report joins a large body of reporting from Palestinian, Israeli, and international organizations who have arrived at the same legal conclusion. It is an important wake-up call. The scale and the seriousness of the violations documented make it clear that the international community and Canada need to urgently change its approach. It is increasingly unsustainable for Canada to avoid grappling with these concurring conclusions. Apartheid is a crime against humanity, and Canada has an obligation to act under international law.
Now we will turn to Madame Langlois, please.
Good evening, and thank you to the committee for its invitation. The stakes of human rights at large are very serious, and there are direct attacks on democracy and human rights. Democracies are threatened from the outside as well as the inside. I also stress the latest report of Amnesty International after detailed reports on the occupied territories in Palatinate. It's an apartheid policy by the State of Israel vis-à-vis the Palestinians. The show, of course, is a fact, and it did occur. Anti-Semitism is always present throughout the world, including here. But this cannot excuse or explain that a policy of apartheid in Israel be conducted against the Palestinians in the occupied territories. Thank you.
Mr. Neuer of UN Watch, my apologies. You have 5 minutes, sir.
Thank you. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here testifying before the committee, and I'd like to share with you some of my thoughts from the United Nations Human Rights Council, where I'm speaking to you here in Geneva. The 2022 session just opened, and sadly, although the founding resolution of the Council 60/251, which was adopted in 2006, when the Council was created as a body to reform the Human Rights Commission, although members were supposed to be those upholding the highest standards, we see the very opposite. We see that dictatorships are increasing in their audacity in human rights abuses and in their audacity to join the Human Rights Council. The current membership of the Council is the worst that it's ever been. 68.1% of the Council failed to meet minimal democracy standards. I will just conclude with mentioning that I disagree with Amnesty International completely in their comments about the situation in Israel. I've spent a lot of time there, and there are problems there, but to accuse it, as they have done, of apartheid is absurd. Israel has full equality for Arabs.
Conclude your testimony, please.
And are elected, and has an Arab party in the government. So as French President Macron recently said, this accusation is absurd on its face. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Neuer. Thank you to all three of our witnesses. Now we will turn the floor to questions, and each member will have 7 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I'm going to direct my questions to Mr. Neuer. Mr. Neuer, like you, I take issue with the suggestion that Israel is the #1 human rights issue in the world, a thriving democracy with an independent judiciary who has a strong track record overall when it comes to human rights. And now I want to address a specific issue, namely the recent nomination of the Special Rapporteur on Palestine, the nomination which occurred last Thursday, the person nominated being Francesco Albanese. Do you have concerns with this nomination?
Thank you for that timely question, because the appointment is about to happen in a few weeks. And indeed, I do have concerns about the nominee for this position as Special Rapporteur on Palestine, Francesca Albanese, and those concerns would have been expressed by Stéphane Dion, Canada's foreign minister, several years ago, in regard to the current mandate holder 6 years ago, Michael Lynk, when he was nominated. Canada's foreign minister at the time, Stéphane Dion, said that the nomination violated the Council's principles of objectivity and impartiality, because the candidate at that time, Michael Lynk, had a lengthy record of making prejudicial statements and engaging in campaigning to target Israel, and was not objective or impartial, and it was motivated by political considerations. In this case, the candidate, once again, is a product of a politicized process. Francesca Albanese is a lifelong campaigner against Israel. She has accused Israel of being a racist state, a colonial state, and her husband is someone who has worked for the Palestinian government. These are conflicts of interest that she has not disclosed, but this is just sort of an additional thing, that she is a lifelong anti-Israel lobbyist. She does not hide that. So the Canadian ambassador here several years ago, Ambassador Goldberg, when she was sitting on the consultative group, she tried to select someone named Christine Cerna, who had no record of politicization and bias, and that was rejected by the Council. And the Arab and Islamic countries said they specifically want someone who, quote unquote, is an expert. What they meant, they wanted someone who was completely anti-Israel. And that is contrary to the founding resolutions of the Council, which require someone to be impartial and objective. There's no question a brief review of her application of Francesca Albanese will see that she has been a lifelong campaigner for the Palestinian cause. She supports, quote unquote, resistance, which she's not shy that includes violence against Israel. She is completely inappropriate. And I do hope that the Canadian government, as they did 6 years ago when Michael Lynk was nominated wrongly and they called for a review, I hope they do the same thing prior to the appointment, which will take place in about 4 weeks' time. I hope that the Canadian government expresses their support for the founding principles of the Council, which require impartiality and not the opposite, politicization.
Well, thank you for that. And among other things, she has attended an event of an organization linked to Hamas. You note the rules of the Council as defined by Resolutions 5.1 and 1621 in terms of impartiality and objectivity that are to be of a paramount importance. So I think it would be fair to say she doesn't come close to meeting that requirement.
That is absolutely the case. And there was a law professor in McGill who has written on this phenomenon where certain individuals are chosen not despite their prejudicial statements and their bias, but precisely because of it. And he was referring to someone who was appointed at the time of the Goldstone report. But sadly, this is becoming systematic at the Human Rights Council. The most significant mechanism to target Israel is the Commission of Inquiry that they created in May, which was put forward by Pakistan and the Palestinian delegation. And the person they appointed was Navi Pillay, who's the former UN rights chief, but she's someone who in the past 2 years has actively lobbied governments to, and I'm quoting, sanction Israeli apartheid. She signed this statement in 2020 to lobby governments. She signed another manifesto in June 2021 that condemned Israel for committing crimes during the last war. And she absurdly has been appointed to head an inquiry into whether Israel is racist and whether it committed crimes when she's already lobbied governments on precisely that point. I used to be an attorney, and if you go before a judge and ask that judge to recuse himself or herself, you would immediately achieve that result. We've submitted a 30-page recusal request, and we hope that Navi Pillay will recuse herself, and we hope that all other civil society groups that are committed to the principles of impartiality that oblige commissioners to have that impartiality will speak out in this regard.
Thank you for that. And we have now a nominee who fails to satisfy even the most minimal standards of impartiality. But Mr. Noor, I'd be interested if you could elaborate a little bit on the mandate of the Special Rapporteur and the discriminatory nature of the mandate of the Rapporteur and any recommendations that you would have for Canada to take in light of that.
Yes, the mandate was created in February 1993. It goes back nearly 3 decades, and it even predates the Oslo Accords when the Palestinian Authority entered Ramallah, Nablus, Hebron, cities that they control, and Jenin and Bethlehem, and Hamas rules Gaza. So the mandate predates that. It's the only mandate that only looks at one side. The other special rapporteurs, whether it's on Sudan, will look at all sides. And we'll look at the human rights situation in a region. This one, as the current mandate holder has acknowledged, only looks at one side. It looks at, quote, its mandate is to investigate, quote, Israel's violations of the principles and bases of international law. It does not look at abuses by the Palestinian Authority, terrorism by the
Mr.
PA,
Neuer, your time is up.
Hamas
If you could
and
wrap it up,
Islamic
please.
Jihad terrorism by Islamic Jihad, the PA, and Hamas are systematically ignored. They're presumed to be violations, and that is why Amnesty International in the past and other groups have said that this bias
if you could wrap it up, please.
One-sided. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'd like to begin with the interesting report that Amnesty International has presented of the situation in Palestine. I am not the first to say Human Rights Watch did a similar job or report recently. In 2018, I was part of a delegation, parliamentary delegates, to visit the occupied territories in the West Bank, and we were able to speak with various citizens, and we saw that it was a military opposition, control, a wall, and the daily humiliation of the Palestinian people who don't make the headlines. There's no active military bombing going on, but it's a spiteful treatment of the population. In Hebron, for example, collective punishment. We destroy homes to make space for illegal occupation and construction. So I'd like to hear more from Ms. Nivya Bandi, which leads you to the conclusion that using the expression apartheid to describe what is the situation of Palestinian populations right now. Concrete examples, please. Okay, I thought maybe someone else was going to start, but I can comment.
English again. So yes, thank you for that question. And I just want to point out that often when we hear apartheid, I think people associate it immediately with South Africa, with the context of South Africa. And it's important to note that apartheid looks different in different situations. In international law, what it actually means is a systematic, prolonged, cruel, discriminatory treatment of one racial group members towards another with the intention to control the other group. So what you're pointing out is indeed part of what we have observed over the past 4 years. And my first call will be to encourage you and encourage this committee perhaps to do this, what you did a few years ago, and to visit this for yourselves. Some of the examples of this system that we've observed are, for instance, severe movement restrictions in the West Bank, which are enforced through a network of checkpoints and road closures with permit systems, which force Palestinians who want to visit other areas of the occupied Palestinian territories to seek the permission of the Israeli military. We've seen the denial of nationality to Palestinian citizens of Israel, or the systematic denial of building permits to Palestinians in East Jerusalem, but also the expansion of illegal settlements in East Jerusalem as well. The denial, and this is why we extend our definition of apartheid beyond Israel and the OPT to displaced Palestinians, the denial of Palestinian refugees internationally protected rights to return. Israel bars Palestinian families who have been displaced for generations to return to their former villages. And then we also see restrictions on access to land and fishing areas in the Gaza region, for instance. And there are statistics that are, speak to this in more detail. But when you look at all these elements together, and rather than in a fragmented manner, when you look at all these various elements together, including the crimes of forcible transfer, detention and torture, unlawful killings and injuries, and the denial of basic rights, all these crimes and systems put together, so the pattern of laws, policies, and practices together then amounts to apartheid under international law, the definition that it has in the Apartheid Convention and the Rome Statute. So that has been our approach and our conclusion.
Merci beaucoup, Madame Nivia Bandi.
Thank you very much, Madam Nivia Bandi. I also observed quite a few troubling things. Bus circuits and routes that are prohibited from Palestinian use, roads that can't be used. I don't understand how in the 21st century you think that in a democracy such as Israel that they would respect human rights. A number of other things struck me as quite exceptional. The arrest and prosecution of children by Israeli military forces. We met a group of lawyers who are defending the rights of these children, young adolescents, often stopped for having thrown stones or some other behavior. And is that part and parcel of your analysis of the infraction of human rights in this area? Well, yes, of course. But to continue with what my colleague was saying, these are the daily humiliations that Palestinians live with. Repression, which is quite disproportionate to the actual reality. Number of cases of young persons, also adults, who find themselves imprisoned under all sorts of pretexts and have to face justice, which is completely arbitrary, at a long list, but particularly for the youth, children, in fact, is very, very shocking.
And at this juncture, allow me to, on behalf of the entire committee, thank all three of the witnesses, not only for their testimony, but for their time. We're very, very grateful.